My name is Christopher Gallant, and this is my mini-lecture on the second section of the second chapter of Principles of Psychology, namely pages 36 to 44. The chapter primarily concerns itself with psychology and the scientific method as it applies to psychology. The second section begins with defining the term hypothesis, which is a key part of the scientific method. A hypothesis is a tentative explanation for a relationship between two or more variables. Psychological variables tend to be behaviors. So when entering into a psychological experiment, the experiment will be conducted based on a hypothesis that is concerned with behaviors being variables. When it comes to hypotheses and trying to prove whether one is better than another, an easy method of doing this is with Occam's razor, the principle that suggests when choosing between competing hypotheses, the simpler one, requiring the fewer assumptions, is usually better. So in other words, when somebody suggests two possible answers to a problem, the simpler answer is likely the better one. This is not always the case, but it is often the case. The textbook provides an example in the form of Clever Hans. Clever Hans was a horse who appeared to understand mathematics, but the hypothesis that the horse understood mathematics was a heavily complicated hypothesis that featured several assumptions and was disproven by the more simpler hypothesis that the owner of the horse was giving it cues to suggest how to calculate things, or in other words, to suggest the answers to problems. So in this case, Occam's razor could be used to predict which answer, the simpler answer, was the better answer being that the horse did not actually understand mathematics, but was actually being cued by its owner. Once the hypothesis is established, we then move into the experimentation stage. Experimentation is the scientific approach of deliberately manipulating a variable to then observe whether and how other variables are altered in response. And of course, in psychology, this primarily means studying behaviors, the variables being the behaviors. Or behaviors or persons. The independent variable is the variable that is deliberately manipulated. So some circumstance in the experiment is deliberately manipulated so as to view the result. The dependent variable is the variable suspected to be affected when the independent variable is manipulated. In other words, you manipulate the independent variable, and the dependent variable is what you believe will be affected after the manipulation occurs. For example, in an experiment, if you raise the temperature, you likely suspect somebody will begin sweating, as that's not really a behavior. So instead, if you lower the temperature, you will likely observe somebody shivering. Because that is a behavior that is commonly caused by extreme cold. The experimental group is a group of individuals for whom you have manipulated the independent variable in the experiment. In other words, they're the people being experimented on. The control group is the group of individuals who closely resemble those in the experimental group, but were not manipulated. In other words, They are the people who were not experimented on and can be used as a comparison to note differences and similarities. Replication is repeating of an experiment to compare results. You repeat an experiment a few times and check your results to see if they are consistent. If they are consistent, then likely you will discover an answer to whatever problem you are trying to solve. Once the experiment is completed, it is best to review the experiment using techniques such as meta-analysis, the careful review of many studies that tries to gauge whether there really is an effect of the manipulation on the behavior of interest. Also, strong inference comes in handy. It is a prescribed method for conducting scientific inquiry that consists of repeatedly disproving hypotheses. In order to make sure that your hypothesis really checks out, it's best to come up with an alternative hypothesis. And if that hypothesis doesn't count out, then the original one is more likely to be the right. The textbook offers an example in the hypothesis. Professors will encourage women and men equally to enter their respective fields of study. This was an initial hypothesis for an experiment. An alternative hypothesis, a strong inference, was created that, in fact, there would be some bias based on gender. And after the experimentation was conducted and testing was done, the result was bias was actually shown. So in other words, the alternate hypothesis proved to be more accurate than the initial hypothesis, which is why reviewing the experiment is important. And the final part of the section is theory, which is very important because after all the experimentation is done and you've come to the conclusion that either your hypothesis is wrong or right, if your hypothesis is right and it corresponds with several other hypotheses about a particular phenomenon, then that group of hypotheses forms a theory, which in exact terms is a group of hypotheses about a particular phenomenon that have survived all current testing and that are compatible with one another. And that is the end of the second section of the second chapter of Principles of Psychology. Thank you.